Do you ever feel like you're constantly putting up your guard and ready to defend every parenting decision you make? In today's episode, we're talking about something that's been bugging me lately: defensiveness. You know, that knee jerk reaction we have when someone questions our choices or suggests we do things differently? That's the one. Stick around as we unpack defensiveness to help us all become a little more open and a lot less stressed. Welcome back, my friends. This is Fulfillment Therapy, the podcast dedicated to helping parents rediscover their passion for life and overcome the overwhelm of parenting and marriage. I'm your host, Kendra Nielsen, and today we are talking about defensiveness. So, this is episode number 192: Overcoming Defensiveness, Cultivating Self-Awareness as a Parent and Spouse. We all need a little bit of help with this. The reason that I decided to do this was because I was talking to a friend recently, and I was starting to notice this pattern with her of becoming very defensive when she felt like she was getting negative feedback with either her parenting or her marriage or whatever that was. And I was thinking, oh, wow, she's quite defensive. And then I laughed a little bit and I was like, I feel like I've heard my husband say that about me before, but I often just think it's other people. So I thought maybe it's time to really examine whether or not I'm defensive, and if I am, what I can do about it. I wanted to share my findings with you to see if you can take your life to the next level in this way as well. Let's start with a quick assessment so you can really determine if you are too defensive. Answer yes or no to these following questions. Do you ever feel attacked? Do you often feel attacked or criticized when receiving feedback? Is your first instinct to explain or justify your actions when questioned? Do you find it difficult to admit when you're wrong? Do you frequently feel the need to defend your spouse or children, even in minor situations? Are you quick to become angry or upset when someone disagrees with you? Now, if you answered yes to any of these questions, you might be struggling with defensiveness. But don't worry, my friends, we're going to talk about some simple strategies to help you become more self-aware and less defensive, because I was pointing fingers and seeing how other people were defensive instead of looking inwardly and exploring how I might be defensive. So that's what I am also trying to do right now today. So what is defensiveness? Defensiveness is a self-protective behavior that occurs when we perceive a threat to our self-image or our beliefs or people in our family, our loved ones, and is a natural response, but when it becomes excessive, it can cause harm to our relationships and personal growth. Dr. John Gottman, I love him and a lot of the things that he teaches, especially in families and relationships. He says defensiveness is really a way of blaming your partner. You're saying, in effect, the problem isn't me, it's you. In this quote, he's just specifically talking about your relationship as a spouse, as a partner. So explore that one for a minute. Do you often find that when you're getting defensive, what you're really trying to say is, no, it's you. You're trying to take that finger pointing at you and point it back towards them. Now, if you notice you get in that habit of wanting to point that finger, then that is defensiveness. Let's put that finger down for a minute. I'll give you some examples so you can better understand this, especially when it comes to marriage and parenting. A mom becomes defensive when her spouse suggests a different approach to disciplining their child. Now, this can be a teen, this can be a toddler, but chances are very high that you both have different ideas of how that should be handled. Typically, one is a little bit more into discipline and one's a little bit more into compassion, and it's finding that balance, and that can be a struggle. And do you feel like you want to point that finger and say, no, you're wrong, I'm right, even if it's in a softer way or just in your head? Here's another example. A father quickly justifies his long work hours when his spouse expresses concern about his absence. I know that's come up for both my husband and I at times, especially when we're entrepreneurs, because there's not this very scheduled and structured hours sometimes. And that can be a trigger for us depending on what it is we are experiencing at the moment. Parents become defensive when grandparents offer unsolicited parenting advice. Do you point that finger and get frustrated when you feel like they are giving you feedback? It's not to say that you can't do something about it as far as how things are approached and how you handle it, but are you quickly looking to point that finger of blame and justify your actions? What happens if there's too much defensiveness? That can strain relationships with your spouse and your children. That can create difficulties in growing personally and improving that personal improvement you're seeking for. It can strain different friendships. Like I was mentioning this friend of mine, I love her dearly. And it makes it so that I'm not open to sharing more with her because I know she's not always going to be receptive. Instead of it being an open relationship where she might hear me and have enough humility to seek greater understanding and growth, it just stays stuck a little bit. It can also increase conflict and misunderstandings in relationships. Maybe you're thinking of those times when your spouse has pointed the finger at you, but I think about the times when you have pointed that finger at your children or at your husband or your wife, whoever it is that's listening. And it can also reduce emotional intimacy within the family. So I'll give you an example here of a client. So I have this client that has 2 children, and she found herself constantly on edge and ready to defend her parenting choices all the time. It was very hard to feel like we were getting very far in therapy because of this. That defensiveness created tension between her and her husband and even affected her relationship with her kids. It wasn't until she recognized this pattern that she could really begin to change. Now, contrast that to another experience where I could tell that one of my clients was pretty defensive, so I took things a little slower. I tried to model for her how to be more open and less defensive. At some point, I was like, okay, this is healthy confrontation that you do in any therapeutic session. And I was like, need to challenge her a little bit more on some of these things, even though she doesn't necessarily like it. She completely lost it, was very upset, instantly quit counseling, and justified all of her behaviors. That shows there's not much open mindedness. There's not a willingness to see another perspective or put yourself in other people's shoes and to own your part, to own your side of the street instead of staying in that victim mentality and staying in that defensiveness. Hopefully, she will get to that point someday where she will be able to see her side of the street and come back and, whether it's me or anybody else, take more ownership so she can have that healing. Like my other client that was able to see her part and begin to change. So let's talk about what defensiveness looks like. This might be counteracting or blaming others, making excuses and deflecting responsibility, responding with sarcasm or dismissiveness, or even stonewalling or withdrawing from conversations. Like these are all an attempt to shift the blame and to stay in our stuck mindset and nurse our wound. Brene Brown said this: defensiveness is a sign that we're not willing to own our part in a situation. It's a way of avoiding vulnerability. I completely second that. And I don't think we often think about defensiveness being a way of avoiding vulnerability, but it really is. It stems from so many fears, often that we're not enough. Most of those things when I work with my clients is I'm not enough. I'm bad. I'm not worthy. I'm hurting other people. And it's so painful for them to face that instead they just point that finger instead of take more ownership. And that is where true joy comes, but it's too painful to do that. Now, I say that carefully because I know we all do that, myself included, and it can be very subtle and hard to recognize sometimes. So how do we break free from that defensive trap? Because again, it's subtle, right? You can practice self-awareness. Again, easier said than done, but just a couple ways you can do that. Pay attention to your emotional reactions in conversations. Do you feel like you're trying to point a finger in that conversation? And notice physical cues in your body, like increased heart rate or clenching your jaw, or maybe going to those same patterns. You withdraw and you shut down, or raising your voice, whatever it is where it's not as regulated. The second thing you can do is pause and reflect. Take a deep breath before responding. This actually does work. Then ask yourself, Why am I feeling threatened? It's about that curiosity instead of going to that blame, whether for yourself or others. Like, why do I feel so activated right now? And let's explore that a little bit instead of pointing the fingers at others. The third thing you can do is listen actively. Focus on understanding the other person's perspective. Now, a lot of times this is often the spouse because that's who we're most reactive to, the other adult in the room that is always around. Avoid interrupting and formulating rebuttals while they are speaking, but really seek for that humility. I know a lot of times when I feel myself getting activated, I have a mantra or a prayer in my head that please help me be humble, help me relax, help me calm down. And then I also have to proactively act on that. The fourth thing you can do is take responsibility. This is a very important step. Focus on understanding the other person's perspective. Again, this does not mean you have to agree with them, but put yourself in their shoes and recognize that both of you can be right. You just have different narratives. And it's arriving in that middle area where you can see both sides. As always, use I statements so you can express your feelings without that finger pointing. And then the last one is practice that empathy. See it from their point of view and validate their feelings, even if you disagree. Another quick story for you. I have a client that he's a father of 3, and he realized he was constantly defensive about his parenting style. When his wife suggested that he spend more one-on-one time with their oldest child, he felt attacked and frustrated. But then when he took time and we processed it a little bit, he recognized that his wife's idea or suggestion really did come from a place of love. And this helped him respond more openly and led to him being more proactive in his parenting and make those positive changes because he was receptive. Now, maybe he wasn't initially, but he did end up taking ownership and doing what he could to improve. This improved his relationship not only with his oldest child, but with his wife as well, because he let go of that defensiveness and changed those patterns. How can we cultivate that wisdom and that self-awareness, again, when it feels so elusive? This just involves things like regular self-reflection. That's why processing is important through journaling or having a therapist, and then seeking feedback from trusted friends that you're not so reactive to. It also involves things like mindfulness to stay present in those challenging situations. I don't always love it myself, but I recognize that when I take the time to do mindfulness meditations, like those guided meditations, go on walks and I do that a little bit, it really helps keep me grounded and less reactive. If you feel like this is happening more, look up guided meditations on topics that you feel triggered about regularly, like maybe defensiveness, parenting, all of those things, and just practice doing that for 5 minutes a day and see if it helps, because I think you'll be surprised. Dr. Daniel Siegel is a renowned psychiatrist, and he said, mind sight is a kind of focused attention that allows us to see the internal workings of our own minds. It helps us be aware of our mental processes without being swept away by them. So what he's saying here is if we can develop that mind sight, that will allow us to stay grounded and not be swept away by challenges or that defensiveness as it rises up. It allows us to take a step back so we don't get stuck in those negative patterns. All right, let's briefly apply that to daily life. When your child criticizes your rules, take a moment to listen before responding. Maybe even count to 5, whatever it takes for you to relax and not respond quickly in a negative way. Now maybe your spouse is pointing out a mistake. Practice acknowledging it without justification. That can be hard, especially if you feel like there's this pattern of fault finding. And you might want to point that finger and say, you always see the bad in me. Maybe you can point that finger and look at you as well and say, maybe I'm also getting defensive too much. So it's probably a little bit of both, and exploring that. But I do that simple thing that you can do of just acknowledging it without justifying or over-explaining why you did something. When you're feeling defensive about a parenting choice, just pause and consider another perspective. Bite your tongue. Again, Easier said than done. Another quick story is I have another client who is a working mother, and she often feels defensive about her decision to pursue a career. When her mother in law made some comments about working moms, she would respond reactively. She would get angry. But when we applied some of these things that we're talking about, she learned to respond more calmly. This helped improve her relationship with her in laws, but it also reduced her own stress levels. And you can see how that might happen for you as well. How do you think you could take it to the next level? Even if you don't think you're defensive, let's think about it as a spectrum. Maybe you can get a little bit better about this, a little less defensive. So let's just recap these things quickly for today. Defensiveness is a natural response, but excessive defensiveness can harm relationships and personal growth. When we recognize defensive behaviors, that is the first step to overcoming them. And when we practice that self-awareness, active listening, and empathy, that can lead to a more balanced response. It's important to cultivate wisdom through mindfulness and self-reflection, because that can lead to that more balanced response instead of that knee-jerk reaction that we have. And it will help us improve our ability to take ownership. Remember, my friends, overcoming defensiveness is a journey and not a quick destination. It's that slow and steady improvement over time that will bear the fruits. So be patient with yourself as you practice these new skills. And when we reduce that defensiveness, you really will open the doors to deeper connections with your spouse and children, especially later in life, and that will lead to a more fulfilling family life. Thank you, my friends, for tuning in to Fulfillment Therapy today. Until next time, keep growing, keep learning, and keep striving for that fulfilling life that you deserve. Don't forget to check out our new courses for personal growth and marriage, as well as our business courses that will help you create an online business that will take your life to the next level and give you that flexibility that you're craving for your family life. So if you're interested in any of those, check those out, and we will see you back here in just a few days.